by my opponent, which he claims that No Child Left Behind is failing to meet its promises. That was his major claim, by the way. His secondary claims were that there is a system in place to assure accountability, that there's a funding issue at hand, not a testing issue, and that change is happening. My claim is that my opponent's evidence fails to adequately support his claims. The first claim I'll be responding to is that there are systems in place to assure accountability. I had to get this information from his outline because he doesn't actually say it in his speech. The only reference to this claim is shortly after his introduction, when my opponent says that in order to have accountability, NCLB does the standardized testing, which isn't the best way to measure what a student does or doesn't know, since some students are just bad test takers. Well, that seems to be the primary claim that he's making, not what's on his outline. And the thing is, he has no real support for this, aside from maybe some personal experience as an educator himself. So whether intentional or not, he doesn't really address this claim and uses it more as a segue to transition to his secondary claim, which is that there's a funding issue and not a testing issue. He opens by saying that schools whose students are performing well receive extra funding, while schools whose students are performing poorly had funding taken away. This is simply not true. For starters, most of the money that public schools receive isn't federal. It comes from the state and local level. According to Lisa Blummerman, who's chief of the U.S. Census Bureau Government Division, revenues for our nation's public elementary through secondary school systems come primarily from local government sources of income. She doesn't actually give the stats in her article, but she has a nice little chart off to the side. It's about 87.5% of the funding that public schools get comes from local and state levels, so that the federal government doesn't touch that at all. 12.5 comes from the federal, and that is still a lot of money, especially when we're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's a lot less than I thought when he initially made the speech. Furthermore, this money isn't at all dependent on the scores of the test. According to the U.S. Department of Education, Title I, Part 8 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as amended, provides financial assistance to local educational agencies and schools with high numbers or high percentages of children from low-income families to help ensure that all children meet challenging state academic standards. Basically, the amount of school received from the federal government, known as Title I money, is based on the amount of students from low-income families that they have at their school. Test scores don't factor into this at all. That being said, only schools that do the standardized testing are eligible for this Title I money. Moving on to the third claim, that there's change happening. Much like the first claim, there's a lack of evidence here. The only real evidence provided is some paraphrasing from the New York Times, in which the president apparently said, asked for a revision of the bill, and that's it. That was all the evidence provided to prove the claim that change was happening. My opponent himself says that there's a need for change, a recognition for this change, but no one is taking action. If no one is taking action, then change isn't happening. So that claim is wrong, false. In conclusion, I'm not saying that the position that my opponent took was wrong. I'm not even saying that his major claim was wrong. All I'm saying is that because of lack of evidence and some serious misconceptions, my opponent's evidence fails to adequately support his claims. Thank you.
All right, Bob, I thought that you did a very good job at the beginning labeling the major and the secondary claims that the advocate presented. You've got a general position that you're taking, that you're not really going to be arguing so much the substance of the argument as it is that you're going to be refuting the lack of grounds in the presentation and not really offering counterclaims for the most part. I thought that your issue of accountability signpost was pretty clear, and you explained and you summarized what the advocate's claim was clearly. You challenge a lack of data. I think that's fine. The funding being related to the testing issue, I think that that's a pretty important component here. I thought you had some good information that talked about how federal funding is only a minimal part of what the schools have available to them, and that funding is largely unconnected to the testing procedures. That's, I think, You've got an inference there that you're making from the one piece of evidence on the Title I funding, but then right at the end it makes it sound like that is in fact, in order to get the Title I funding, they have to do the testing. So there is a connection there, and that was a little bit confusing. If they're going to get the money regardless of how they do on the testing, then it doesn't sound like there's any harm to the testing process. If that money is reallocated because of the test scores, which is what it appears to be the advocate's claim is, then there is something that's relevant here, and I think you need a stronger answer. I do think the argument that says the substantial amount of the money is not federal in the first place, and that's not going to be affected by any of the testing procedures, that might address whatever reservation they have. Did the advocate really make a claim that there was going to be some harm to schools because of reallocation of test money or funding based on the testing? I think that's another argument that you need to develop a little bit. The absence of any information to suggest that there is going to be a consequence. Have any schools suffered a loss of money? Have they closed down any schools? Are students, from schools that are struggling, have they been hurt by this sort of process? That's what the advocate would have needed to present, and I think you needed to press them a little bit harder on some of those kinds of things. So you're kind of talking about budget issues instead of outcomes, and I think the budget issue is a good place to start, but I think you want to press on some of the outcomes also. The signpost on the third point is also very clear. I do think it's a little bit confusing because basically you're just saying the advocate made an argument that some reform is going into place, and the truth of the matter is nothing is being done on this. You're not advocating that there be any reform. You're just kind of denying that claim, and I don't know that you get that much just automatically taking challenging that particular point. I think you can look at this and say, all right, if this is true, what does it prove? What inferences should we reach based on the fact that people are proposing reform? That they see something wrong with the testing process, or they see something wrong with the funding system. There's no explanation about what the reforms are, so you can't make an inference from that. I think that might make a more appropriate way of looking at that argument. Because if you just say, well, the president said maybe there should be some revision, and he said that 3 years ago and nothing's been done since. Okay, so nothing's being done. So what conclusion should we draw based on that? That the advocate is inadequately informed about what the current status of the issue is, and that we should at this point not make any decision about what is true until we were better informed about those issues. Maybe that's the way to present it. All right, thank you for getting us started.